Last week, we talked about Robert E. Lee and answered some of the suggested internet search questions about that famous person during the American Civil War. Today, we are going to talk about the Union General who was the top commander for the federal armies during the American Civil War. He is also a very recognized figure. He's often placed beside Robert E. Lee in images and textbooks, usually in a reference to the surrender at Appomattox. Yes, today we are talking about General Ulysses S. Grant and his role during the American Civil War. I'm Sarah Kay Bierle with GZ665, and today we are going to answer 4 of the internet search questions about Ulysses S. Grant. Now, you may have noticed this video is a little different than the other ones that we have done. So I am out running some errands today, getting ready to actually move across the country. So we are recording some videos while waiting for our next appointment. So hope you enjoy them and enjoy the different location, and we'll get back to those well-stocked bookcases in a couple of weeks. Question number 1. What is Ulysses S. Grant famous for? Well, I would say Grant is most famous for being the Union General who defeats Robert E. Lee and brings the American Civil War toward a conclusion. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865, where Grant is accepting the surrender of the Confederates, is going to be a major step in the ending of the war. A lot of textbooks, a lot of people think the war just ended on that day and at Appomattox Courthouse, but there were some other things that had to be wrapped up, fought out, finished up before the conflict concluded in the military sense. So I would say Grant is most famous for being a winning general of the American Civil War. Question number 2. What was Ulysses S. Grant's role in the American Civil War? Great question. So he starts off commanding in the Western Theater. He moves up in rank, becomes a commanding general in that region, and he really catches Lincoln's attention because Grant is a fighter. And if he doesn't succeed the first time, he's going to find another way to try, and he keeps on going. So in March 1864, Grant becomes lieutenant general. So he is in charge of directing all of the federal armies. He answers to President Lincoln, and Grant is going to be in charge of strategy, how to employ and deploy those armies in ways that are going to put the pressure on the Confederacy and bring the war to a close. They were hoping swiftly. It ended up being a little over a year, about 13 months, because the Confederacy was not quite ready to give up their fight, but Grant's strategy puts pressure on all points of the southern states still in rebellion, and he devises a strategy and then has the generals who trust him to be able to carry out these campaigns that will lead to the end of America's bloodiest conflict. Question number 3. What did Ulysses S. Grant accomplish? Well, we've just kind of talked about some of his accomplishments, right? We talked about him being a successful general. I mean, he takes Forts Henry and Donelson. There's 2 forts. Sometimes they end up slid together, but Fort Henry, Fort Donelson. He's involved in their capture. He fights at the Battle of Shiloh. He's going to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi, which was the last stronghold of the Confederacy on the Mississippi River. Then he's going to fight some battles in the Tennessee area as the Union armies are pushing deeper into the heart of the Confederacy. Becomes lieutenant general. Will accompany General George Gordon Meade, the Army of the Potomac, on the Overland Campaign in the spring of that year. He will tenaciously hold on, continue the continuous fight, which is sometimes called a siege, at Petersburg through the summer, fall, and then winter of 1864 to 1865. And then it's his armies, and he will be with the troops that are achieving the breakthroughs, that are capturing Richmond, and then the pursuit of Lee to Appomattox Courthouse, where Grant will accept the surrender of Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. We talk about Grant's military successes. I think it's also important to note a couple of other things that really stand out in his life. Of course, he was a president. So he's going to be the 18th president of the United States. So you have Lincoln, Johnson, and then Grant. Grant will be president during the Reconstruction era. He also goes through some financial crises during his term, some scandals with his cabinet. So he does not have the easiest of presidencies. And when it's all over, he and his wife Julia were very anxious to just kind of be done with politicking in Washington and all of that. It wasn't really their scene. So shortly after he finished his term in office, he took a world tour, and he was welcomed in many foreign countries as kind of this celebrity, but not celebrity necessarily in the modern sense. And I think some of my favorite stories are about the time that they spent in Egypt. They were cruising on the Nile, and they were stopping and seeing all these sites of ancient Egypt, and it's just a really fascinating thing to think about. Another thing that Grant accomplished was he was working on the writing of his memoirs, and he finished the war years period before his death. He died of cancer. But he pushed through even with all the health struggles that he was having, and he told his story. And there are parts of his memoirs that are called into question, usually the case with most memoirs. But it's significant that he took the time, he took the effort to write what he remembered, and in some ways the way he wanted to be remembered and the way he wanted other people to be remembered, which is a really fascinating kind of look into Grant's mind and how he was perceiving the Civil War and that conflict. Question number 4. Why did Ulysses S. Grant change his name? This is a really good one, and I actually pulled out a biography of Grant to make sure I was getting the right information on this. Of course, I always want to give the right information, and if there's a question that I'm not sure on, I'm going to do some research to make sure that it can be as accurate as possible. I know someday there'll be a video and I will have made a mistake, and hopefully a kind viewer will let me know and we'll be able to correct it. Anyway, all that aside, this is a great story about Grant. So, when he was born, his parents, and as some stories go, his grandparents had a hand in his naming. They named him Hiram Ulysses Grant. So that was his name. But he went by Ulysses, or Yules, during his youth. Well, when it came time for him to enter West Point, he had the help of his congressman, and somewhere along the way, they got his name messed up in the paperwork. They went with Ulysses Simpson, which was his mother's maiden name, Grant. So they put that on the official records and all this official paperwork that is being processed at West Point. And as the account goes that I was reading, Grant kept going and trying to get it changed. He's like, this is not my name. I want my name correct. There's never been Simpson in my name. What's the deal with this? Well, they wouldn't change it, they wouldn't change it, and they wouldn't change it. So finally, he gave up and started signing Ulysses S. Grant. But for a long time, especially in the West Point years, he was signing his name as it was given at birth in kind of this, you gotta get it right. But eventually he gave in and took the name that was somewhat assigned to him at West Point. Now, Grant probably did not think this name change, this forced name change, was a great thing. He definitely did not like it. But years down the road, it turned out to be a good thing in probably a way he could have never anticipated. So his initials are now USG, so U.S. Grant. So first off, you have U.S. That's going to be the same sort of initials as United States. Works great. He's a Union General. He's a federal commander. But it really became even more of his name. One of his nicknames was Unconditional Surrender Grant, because in 1862, when Forts Henry and Donelson were needing to surrender to the federal armies, they asked for terms. And Grant responded, unconditional surrender. So in other words, if you were going to surrender to Grant, if you were Confederates surrendering to Grant, you don't get terms, you get unconditional surrender. And he uses the same terms at Vicksburg, and by then it sort of became this name that the press picked up on, that his soldiers picked up on, so his nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant, fit those West Point assigned initials much better than his given name. So that's a little bit of the story about Grant, his name, how it was forced to change, and how it became a really interesting part of his legend and history in the American Civil War. Well, folks, we have answered the 4 suggested search questions for the search phrase Ulysses S. Grant. And I think what I find interesting about these suggested questions is they tend to be a little on the basic side. I was really excited to see the question that came up about his name. That kind of gave a chance to share a story. We've tried to share some other facts about his life through these questions. But unfortunately, Grant doesn't always have the interest or the draw that some of the other Civil War generals do. And I think that is unfortunate because he has a fascinating life story. He is the winning general, if you will, of the American Civil War. Sure, Sherman accepts the surrender, but Grant is the lieutenant general. He is the top guy in the federal armies during the American Civil War. And it's exciting to see newer biographies that have come out about Grant, and there's beginning to be a lot more information about him than there was when we look back in the history that was written about him, say, several decades ago, more in the mid-20th century. And no, I wasn't alive then, but when you're a historian, you look back at historiography and you see how people have been remembered, what has been written about them, how they've been viewed in the past, as part of the way that we look at biography and the study of history. So in the past, there maybe hasn't been as much interest or as much positive interest in Grant, but that has certainly changed in more recent times. There's a number of fine biographies out there about him, and there's new information and new interest in this really amazing leader militarily, and he attempted at politics, but Grant can be remembered certainly in American history, and what he's most remembered for is being that general who is bringing the Confederacy to its knees and helping the Civil War to come to a conclusion. And Grant wanted it to be a peaceful conclusion, and he sets that forward when he is meeting with Lee at Appomattox. Grant shows a lot of generosity, and I think he is well remembered for that. Well, folks, thanks for joining us for History on the Road, or perhaps it should be more like History in the Parking Lot. It has been a lot of fun to do this episode of Searched and Answered and talk a little bit about Grant. We hope you've enjoyed the episode. Come back and join us next week, and we'll be talking about some other Civil War commanders. I am Sarah Kay Bierle with GZ665. Thanks for joining us for Searched and Answered, and we will see you again soon. Have a wonderful and inspired week. Thanks. Bye-bye.